It is incredibly rare for the United States to import foreign military aircraft. Since the Second World War, there has been precisely one significant occasion when the world's largest and most self-sufficient military superpower looked outside its own borders and purchased a foreign-designed combat jet for frontline service. That aircraft was British. It was the Harrier. So when America looked at the Harrier and said, "We need to buy that," you know Britain had built something extraordinary. But what most people don't know is Britain had something even more extraordinary on the drawing board. A supersonic Harrier, Mach 2 capable, further range, larger payload. It was called the P1154, and the British government cancelled it. Not because it didn't work, not because the technology failed. They cancelled it to save money by buying an American alternative instead. And that American alternative ended up costing more. This is that story. To understand how remarkable the American purchase was, you need to appreciate what they'd already tried. Throughout the 1960s, the United States poured billions into developing its own VTOL combat aircraft. The Ryan 15.5 Vertifan, the Bell X-14, the LTV XC-142 tilt wing. All of them failed to produce a viable frontline fighter. Britain, working with a fraction of the budget, had simply solved the problem first. The Pegasus engine's 4 rotating nozzles, an act of engineering brilliance no amount of American money had been able to replicate. In 1965, a tripartite evaluation squadron stood up at RAF West Raynham in Norfolk, where American, British and West German pilots flew the Kestrel FGA-1, the pre-production military version of the P1127. The Americans went home deeply impressed. Colonel Thomas H. Miller, Jr. of the U.S. Marine Corps, a decorated career veteran who'd rise to lieutenant general, became the foremost champion of buying the production Harrier. Miller understood something fundamental about the Marines. They fight from the sea, from amphibious assault ships, from austere forward bases where there's no concrete runway and never will be. Every other jet fighter in the world needed exactly that. The Harrier didn't. When Miller and his allies started pushing the Pentagon to buy British, the resistance was fierce. The idea offended American industrial pride. It threatened domestic manufacturers. Congressional committees were hostile. To purchase the Harrier was to admit, publicly and on the record, that Britain had built something America could not. The Marines pushed through anyway. In 1969, the procurement was authorized, and between 1971 and 1977, the Corps took delivery of 102 AV-8A Harriers and 8 two-seat TAV-8A trainers. The world's mightiest military had concluded it had no choice but to buy British. And the Harrier was the lesser version of what had been designed. The P1154 wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't an artist's impression in a forgotten magazine or some speculative sketch pinned to a wall. It was a serious, funded, technically advanced military aircraft program that won a NATO-wide design competition, had a revolutionary engine already under development, and reached the stage of detailed design and mock-up construction before it was killed. The man behind it was Ralph Hooper, the quietly determined designer at Hawker Aircraft in Kingston-upon-Thames, who, alongside Sir Sidney Cam, Hawker's legendary chief designer, and Sir Stanley Hooker of Bristol Siddeley, was one of the 3 men most responsible for creating the Harrier itself. By the early 1960s, with the P1127 demonstrator proving that jet-powered vertical takeoff was not only possible but practical, Hooper and his team turned to the obvious next question: could you make it supersonic? The answer they devised was the Bristol Siddeley BS-100 engine, and it was a masterpiece. The BS-100 used something called plenum chamber burning, PCB. Here's the short version. The Harrier's genius was its 4 rotating nozzles, 2 fed by cooler bypass air at the front, 2 by hot core exhaust at the rear. In a conventional afterburning engine, you inject and burn extra fuel behind the turbine, boosting thrust through the rear nozzle only. PCB applied that principle to the front nozzles as well, burning fuel in the bypass air plenum chamber to massively increase thrust through all 4 nozzles simultaneously. The result? 33,000 pounds of thrust, roughly twice the power of the most powerful fighter engines then in service. And here's what makes that number staggering. The Royal Aeronautical Society's own research puts it in perspective. The only contemporary engine producing more thrust was the Pratt & Whitney J58, powering the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. The next fighter engine to exceed the BS-100's planned output wouldn't enter service until 2005, with the Pratt & Whitney F119 in the F-22 Raptor. A 44-year gap. The BS-100 was that far ahead of its time. With this engine, the P1154 was designed to reach Mach 1.7, with some project studies indicating Mach 2 in certain configurations. Combat radius of 250 nautical miles, carrying a 2,000-pound weapons load. Ferranti radar with both air-to-air and ground-mapping terrain-following modes, described at the time as at least a generation ahead of contemporary fighters. One of the world's first operational head-up displays, an inertial navigation system. In every measurable dimension, speed, range, payload, avionics, the P1154 represented a quantum leap beyond the subsonic Harrier. In 1961, NATO issued a requirement designated NBMR-3, a single-seat tactical close support and reconnaissance V/STOL fighter, capable of Mach 0.92 at low level with a 250 nautical mile combat radius, operating from dispersed sites without conventional runways. The P1154 was entered against rival designs from across the alliance, most notably Dassault's Mirage 2-3, which used a battery of dedicated lift jets alongside its main engine. In 1962, the P1154 won the NATO competition outright. Britain, for a brief and shining moment, held the internationally validated blueprint for the Western world's next-generation tactical fighter. And then, Britain killed it. The trouble started where it always starts: inter-service rivalry. That peculiarly British disease where the RAF and the Royal Navy, rather than collaborating to produce a world-beating aircraft, spent their energy ensuring the other service didn't get what it wanted. The RAF wanted a single-seat ground attack and air superiority fighter, a Supersonic Harrier that could operate from dispersed woodland sites in West Germany if the Soviets invaded. The Navy wanted something entirely different, a 2-seat fleet defense fighter with a larger radar, different weapon systems, capable of intercepting Soviet maritime patrol aircraft at long range. Twin Rolls-Royce Spey engines instead of the single BS-100, because the Admiralty refused to accept a single-engined aircraft for over-water operations. 2 services, 2 incompatible aircraft, 1 program budget. Rather than resolving this by choosing one version and letting the other service find a different solution, the defence establishment allowed the argument to fester. The Navy's variant was dropped sometime in 1963 to 1964, with the Admiralty redirected toward a conventional carrier aircraft. But the damage was done. The bickering had delayed the program, inflated cost estimates and, most damagingly, created a political narrative that the P1154 was troubled, mired in indecision. Then came the general election of October 1964. Harold Wilson's Labour government swept to power. Dennis Healey was appointed Secretary of State for Defence, arriving with a mandate to slash costs and rationalise what he saw as an overstretched military-industrial complex. On the 2nd of February 1965, the P1154 was formally cancelled. The stated rationale: development costs too high. Its role could be filled more cheaply by purchasing the American McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, already proven in US service, supplemented by a scaled-down subsonic P1127, which would eventually become the Harrier GR1. Now, were there genuine technical challenges? Yes. The PCB system directed extremely hot afterburning exhaust downward through the front nozzles during vertical takeoff. Temperatures capable of melting asphalt and distorting steel carrier decks. The Soviets would encounter precisely this problem decades later with the Yakovlev Yak-141, their own supersonic VTOL fighter, which was similarly abandoned. Dust and debris ingestion from unprepared surfaces remained a concern. These were real engineering problems. But they were engineering problems, not impossibilities, and they were being actively worked on when the program was cancelled. The decision to kill the P1154 wasn't made because the aircraft couldn't be built. It was made because a new government decided it didn't want to pay for it. That distinction matters enormously because of what happened next. The replacement, the supposedly cheaper American Phantom, ended up costing more than the P1154 would have. The British government ordered two variants: the F4K, designated Phantom FG1 for the Royal Navy, and the F4M, designated Phantom FGR2 for the RAF. Roughly 170 aircraft total, 48 for the Navy, around 118 for the RAF, though final numbers were trimmed. But these weren't standard American Phantoms, not even close. The most significant and expensive change was the engine. The standard American F4 used the General Electric J79 turbojet. The British version was required to use the Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan instead, partly to sustain the British engine industry, partly because the Spey offered better fuel consumption. But the Spey was physically larger than the J79, which meant the Phantom's entire rear fuselage had to be widened and redesigned to accommodate it. This wasn't a simple engine swap. It was a fundamental structural modification. New enlarged air intakes, a reshaped rear fuselage. Every change tested, certified, integrated. Cost upon cost upon cost. The result? An aircraft at roughly double the price of a standard American F4E. Figures of £1.75 to £2 million per unit against around £1 million for a baseline American Phantom. When you count the full program, development, tooling, modification, production, integration, credible assessments suggest the British Phantom program cost at least as much as finishing the P1154 would have, very probably more. But here's the thing that really twists the knife. The Spey-engined Phantom didn't even deliver the performance improvements they'd promised. While low-altitude acceleration was marginally better, the modified air intakes actually degraded high-altitude performance compared to the J79-powered original. Britain had cancelled a world-leading indigenous supersonic VTOL fighter to buy a modified version of someone else's aircraft that cost more, arrived later, and flew worse at altitude than the unmodified American version. If a novelist wrote this, the editor would send it back as too implausible. The entire justification, buying American to save money, wasn't merely wrong, it was the opposite of the truth. And to understand why that loss cuts even deeper, you need to know about Viffing. Viffing, Vectoring in forward flight wasn't a designed capability. It was discovered. Pilots worked out that the 4 rotating exhaust nozzles, which made vertical takeoff possible, could be weaponized in a dogfight. The principle is deceptively simple. You're in air combat. An enemy fighter is closing on your tail. In any conventional aircraft, your options are limited to aerodynamic performance, how fast you turn, how tight you pull. Every fighter in the world obeys the same physics. But the Harrier had those 4 nozzles, and if a pilot rotated them forward in flight, the effect was a massive braking force applied at combat speed. The Harrier would decelerate violently, far more rapidly than any conventional fighter could match. An enemy closing from behind would suddenly find his target almost stopping in mid-air. He'd overshoot, fly past, and present himself as a target instead. The physics were brutal and nearly impossible to counter. You can't VI5 without vectoring nozzles. Nobody else had vectoring nozzles. RAF and USMC pilots developed VI5ing as a formal combat tactic during the 1970s, practicing against conventional fighters in dissimilar air combat training, where it proved consistently devastating. Experienced pilots in Phantoms, F-15s, and other high-performance jets found themselves unable to cope with an opponent that could alter the geometry of a dogfight in ways that violated every assumption about how air combat worked. The Falklands proved it beyond argument. 1982. Sea Harriers of 800 and 801 Naval Air Squadrons, operating from HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. Small carriers that couldn't have launched or recovered any conventional fast jet, achieved roughly 20 confirmed air-to-air kills against Argentine fighters and attack aircraft. Not a single Sea Harrier was lost in air-to-air combat during the entire war. 20-0. Thousands of miles from home, at the extreme limit of logistics, from carriers that were themselves under constant threat. That was the Supersonic Harrier, the consolation prize. The lesser aircraft built only because the P1154 was cancelled. A supersonic Harrier with 33,000 pounds of thrust and VIFFing capability, what would that have done? The question answers itself, and the answer was never allowed to be demonstrated. If the P1154 had been the only program killed, you could call it an isolated misjudgment. A painful but defensible decision under genuine fiscal pressure. It wasn't. On the same day, the 2nd of February 1965, Healy also killed the Hawker Siddeley HS-681, an advanced jet-powered STOL military transport capable of operating from short, unprepared strips. Replaced by the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, a fine aircraft, but not what the HS-681 represented. Then, on the 6th of April 1965, barely 2 months later, the most devastating blow. The BACT-SR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, a supersonic, low-level strike aircraft of extraordinary capability. Unlike the P1154, which was still in detailed design, the TSR-2 had actually flown. Prototype XR-219 made its maiden flight on the 27th of September 1964 from Boscombe Down, and during its brief test program demonstrated performance that fully validated the design. Mach 2 at altitude, extreme speed at very low level, terrain following radar to hug the ground beneath enemy defences. Test pilots called it genuinely exceptional. Healy cancelled it. The replacement was to be the General Dynamics F-111K, an anglicised version of the American swing-wing bomber. And then in 1968, the F-111K order was itself cancelled, leaving the RAF with nothing. eventually forced to cover the TSR-2's roles with a patchwork of the Blackburn Buccaneer and the Phantom, neither of which could do everything the TSR-2 was designed to do. 3 advanced aircraft programs killed in barely 8 weeks during early 1965. A supersonic VTOL fighter, a jet-powered STOL transport, a supersonic strike aircraft, all replaced, initially, by American alternatives. This wasn't one bad decision. It was systematic destruction of an industry. And you can see where that destruction landed if you look at Brough. The Blackburn, then Hawker Siddeley, then British Aerospace, then BAE Systems factory at Brough in the East Riding of Yorkshire, once built extraordinary things. At its peak, approximately 5,500 workers assembled on the airfield to watch a Harrier demonstrate what it could do. Hovering, transitioning, showing off the impossible made routine. 5,500 people who knew how to design, build, tool, assemble and test military aircraft. Generations of skill accumulated over decades, concentrated in one place. That factory is effectively gone now. Just a few office jobs. Just think of the skills lost. Not lost to foreign competition. Not lost to technological obsolescence. Lost because a government decided those skills weren't worth paying for. But here's where the story turns one last time, and the turn is bittersweet enough to sit with. HMS Queen Elizabeth sailed with F-35s on her deck. Supersonic, short takeoff, vertical landing. 60 years after the P1154 was supposed to deliver exactly that capability, Britain finally had it. Built by Lockheed Martin, with Britain as a Tier 1 partner, the highest level of international participation. The F-35B's STOVL capability descends directly from the Harrier's DNA. The concept of vectored thrust for vertical flight that Hawker and Bristol Siddeley pioneered didn't die when the P1154 was cancelled. It went underground, migrated across the Atlantic, evolved through decades of joint development and resurfaced in a different airframe built by a different country for a different era. The supersonic VTOL dream the P1154 promised in 1962 finally arrived. It just took 60 years and required Britain to buy it back from America instead of building it at home. Whether that counts as vindication or the final irony probably depends on who you ask. And some of you will know the answer better than anyone. Subscribe for more stories like this.